This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Before we get into our interview today, I want to thank those people that have contributed to help keep us on the air. If you would like to help keep us on the air, we're not a nonprofit, it's not a donation, but we encourage you to contribute. Go to spiritmatterstalk.com and you'll see what to do. And regardless, our archives, our shows are always and will always be free and available to everyone and anyone. So we are honored to have our guest today. He is author. He is also a photographer. He has spent significant time with Ram Dass, met him in 1968. And he has been primarily a photographer, including freelance work for the New York Times and other publications. The book, Being Ram Dass, it's a great cover. And I love what it says on the back. And we'll be mostly discussing that today. Thank you so very much for taking the time, Ramesh, to come on the show with us today.
I'm really happy to be with you. I think, Phil, you and I had some contact when you were doing American Veda years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure we did.
Yeah.
I get all my DOSes mixed up.
As you might.
Yeah.
We're the servant class.
That's right. Thanks for remembering. Ramesh, we're here mainly to talk about your work with Ram Dass and this incredibly thorough memoir, Being Ram Dass. I should let our listeners know, this is probably the third time we've had somebody on where Ram Dass was the main topic, because we never were able to get him on the show, because of his declining health and so forth over the years. But we had Mirabai Bush on.
Mirabai is a good friend.
Yes, and when her book with Ram Dass came out, and we had Raghu Marcus on. So I want our listeners to fill out the Ram Dass trilogy by going to the archive and listening to the others as well. Maybe we should start with how you met Ram Dass. I mean, you ended up being close to him for more than 50 years. So how did it begin?
And then not so many of us have 50-year friendships.
It's true.
I met him when I was in college, and I never knew Richard Alpert. I just met Ram Dass when he first came back from India, and it was a life-changing experience in that I think that I had it's called darshan, which is like in India it means an encounter or a view of usually of like a holy being or another state of consciousness, and that occurred. That Ram Dass came to where I was in school at Wesleyan in Connecticut, which as it turned out, which I didn't learn until years later, he had done his master's degree in psychology there.
Wow.
And some of his students, when he'd been a student instructor, had by then started teaching psychology at Wesleyan. So they invited him to come speak, and I'm expecting the other half of the Leary-Alpert duo. And this guy walks in the frigid March weather in Connecticut, frozen mud, basically, barefoot in a white dress with a long beard. And he did not look like a Harvard professor anymore.
No, he didn't. No.
I wanted to say two things about the book that I enjoyed. One is you don't judge a book by its cover, but if you were to judge a book by its cover, that is one great picture. And the other thing about the book that
I took that one.
I got the book about a week ago, and I haven't read the entire book, but it's one of those books I picked up, and I do know a bit about Ram Dass, and this speaks volumes about the book. I started reading in the middle, and then I went to the end, and then went back to the front, and I couldn't put it down, and I was moving all over with it. It probably may, at some point I'll read it from beginning to end, but fascinating stories, great insight. The historical context in which it takes place, I have some familiarity with because of my age. And it was just, but even for, and I would really also recommend it for young people that really want to get a taste of that generation and what the growth of spirituality in America, which Phil also brings out in his book, Perkin
Yeah.
Data, putting in context. But that your book really it grabbed me in many ways and was incredibly insightful. And I'm not saying this because you're a guest, but it'll be a book that I would recommend to many people.
Well,
I really
do you have a
appreciate
question,
that.
Dennis?
Okay. Yes, a question. When you first went to see Ram Dass Wesleyan, and I know what cold Connecticut marches are like because I used to live in Massachusetts. Did you go there as a spiritual seeker? Had you any experience with meditation or yoga or anything along those lines, or did you just go in literally and figuratively cold? And what was it that he said that, or was there anything that triggered you at that time?
Well, I had some interest. I had, I was in my early 20s, and I had some kind of an experience when I was 16 or 17 that when I was just sitting in the dunes by the beach, not so far from where I live now, and it was, that's a stage of life where you're going through a lot and opening into what you know not. And I did some sort of intensive breathing, just, instinctively. And I had this experience where the horizon kind of opened up. It was one of those changes in point of view from, being at the center of the universe to being more like the grain of sand on the beach. And something like that happened when I saw Ram Dass for the first time. And I had been studying a bit, mostly Taoism and Buddhism. And I wouldn't say that I knew much about meditation at that point, or I certainly knew nothing about yoga. But I was really searching for my own identity, as we do, and
as many of us did.
Yeah, and I had done some experimenting with modern chemistry as well, I would say I was very open. But what occurred in that evening, and he spoke in a student lounge, and he started talking at maybe 7 or 7:30 in the evening, and it went on until 3 in the morning.
Wow.
And he had been on silence in the Himalayas pretty much, for 6 months, learning yoga and meditation, and he had a lot of juice.
Yeah. And
but what I experienced in that evening was really this kind of change in point of view. Again, shifting from myself as the center of the known universe to realizing there was something beyond me.
And you ended up joining the crowd at Neem Karoli Baba's ashrams for a few years with Ram Dass, and stayed close to him all those years. So let's flash forward a bit, because he was producing books. You worked with him on some, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, he was doing his own writing at that time, mostly, anyway. And
but later on, you worked with him,
yeah.
and even after his stroke, he continued to be productive. What led to this memoir? Which I was really happy to hear about, because when he passed, I thought, geez, there's no good biography of Ram Dass. And then I heard this was coming out, and it's really, substantive and thick. What led to it? Did he have to be talked into it? Did he want to do it?
Yeah, I definitely talked him into it. I mean, he's Mr. Be Here Now. He was not into, re-exhuming the past. And but what we worked out, and what I kind of proposed to him, was that we look back at his life as if through the eyes of the guru, from that soul place. And he thought about it for a while, and finally he bought into it.
Explain what you meant by that and how he received it, and what the process of doing that for a few hundred pages was like.
Well, first, I mean, his idea of the guru is probably different from, the conventional picture we have of Indian gurus coming west and, accumulating followers and all of that. His feeling about guru was that was an inner place. And I think he enunciated that pretty thoroughly in his talks, and partly for that reason, he never set up ashrams and institutions or any of that. And that was Maharaj-ji, our guru's, modus also. He traveled light. And that guru place, Ram Dass came to associate it with what he also called witnessing, which is kind of looking at your own incarnation from the inner place where you're not just the body and the incarnation. And that was one of the alternative titles for this, actually, was Ram Dass and Incarnation. So he agreed to look back at his life from that standpoint, from that inner view, and to kind of bring it up. And I think particularly in relation to the stuff from his childhood and his early life, he was really bringing stuff up and letting it go. And releasing some of the, the attachment that we have for those parts of our lives that, and some of his was, difficult.
Yeah.
And I think he found it freeing. It was really a long process. I mean, we worked on this off and on over 10 years. We had a bunch of ups and downs. I was out working with him when my 14-year-old daughter was run over and killed back home.
Jeez. Very
and that was incredibly intense and wrenching, and it was in some ways wonderful to be with him at that moment. And I think he helped me see that, it wasn't all about my grief in that moment. Not that it took away anything from it, but it helped with the perspective on it. And another time we were working on the phone, and I was in New York and he was in Maui, and we were talking about a book that we'd both been using about Ramakrishna and his disciples. And
Christopher Isherwood's book.
Yeah, wonderful book.
Yeah.
And he said at one point, this was when he was still more mobile, and he said, hang on, I'll go get my copy. And there was nobody else in the house, and I didn't hear him on the phone for a minute or two. And finally I hear this voice saying, I'm on the floor, I fell.
Oh my God.
And there's nobody, else at the other end, and I didn't know what to do. I started calling whoever I could think of. But there was a woman who was a musician who had done some chanting playing with them, and she was a cellist, which Ram Dass had been in his earlier, before stroke life. And she was driving nearby, and she got this message in her head that she had to go see Ram Dass. And she went to the house and, somehow got herself in and called and found him and got him up on the bed and got help. And it turned out he had broken his hip.
Wow.
So this was besides being a rather intimate interchange over years, was, as they say, an interesting journey.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as Ram Dass approached the end of his life on the planet, and obviously he was very aware of his condition and that that his days were coming to an end on the planet. Did he reflect back on his period of life, the period he lived in, and think that there was not so much for him, obviously for him there was a lot of growth, but as a species, Homo sapiens, people, that there was an evolution in a good direction? Did he see, or did he ever reflect on the changes from 1968 until he passed in the world? It's something that I've thought about, because the time now is not totally unlike 1968 when you met him, in that there's tremendous upheaval and change, and it forces us sometimes to go more inward and reflect. And I'm wondering what his thoughts were in reflecting back on his life in regard to the society and the culture.
I think that he felt that good would come out of it. That because he had seen so much positive change in a spiritual direction over that time. I mean, he was really at the kindling of the new age, and whatever that is, in bringing yoga and meditation and spiritual practice into this culture, and it was part of his own evolution, coming out of growing up in the 40s and 50s in a very closed down time, when psychology was taking birth really in this culture, at least on the clinical therapy side of things. And he really had witnessed a lot of that, and I think that he felt that the trajectory, as he saw it in the people that he saw, was very hopeful. Not hopeful. He felt there was an evolution of consciousness that was kind of inevitably toward more enlightened views, but that it was work, and he was trying to help that along, and he did what he could, both in the social action area. He did a lot of work around dying, and with the Seva Foundation, and started this prison ashram project in the 70s.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, finish that thought.
No, he was, both that and this promotion that he taught of spiritual practice over those years.
And if there is and has been an evolution in that direction, he was an instrumental part of it. I mean, in writing American Veda, and speaking about the history, he looms,
really looked at the whole spectrum.
Well, yes, but and he looms as a terribly important figure at this meeting ground of East and West, and became a sort of prototype for all of us who became advocates for this new way of looking at the world. And when I interviewed him for American Veda, and I asked him about his role and all that, he said he was like an uncle to the baby boomer seekers.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's perfect metaphor, because he was he was like your hip uncle to those of us who were, 10, 15 years younger.
Yeah, I was in that cohort, exactly.
Right,
and
right.
so
Yeah.
many people were, and we've
Mhm.
interviewed somebody. In fact, we should include Larry Brilliant, who's
Right.
one of the
Yeah.
people we interviewed in this
Yeah, Larry's a
context.
good brother.
And so it was an apt metaphor, and he was very important. One of the questions I had for you is, did he ever express any regret for anything that he did, said, or whatever, from the time he became a public figure onward? And for example, there were a lot of casualties in the LSD days. Did he ever have any regrets about what happened from his and Leary's advocacy? Or
I think he had his eyes open about what had happened, and I think he felt that Leary had, for one reason or another, and I'm not sure that he blamed it on Timothy. I never met Timothy, so I don't have that anchor and things, but he felt that Leary, maybe because of the persecution from the, in the Nixon period and being declared public enemy #1 and all that craziness, that he had taken this departure from the serious research that they had started out with and taken it public, in kind of the Kesey acid test sphere of things, and had become a real sort of social radical in the same way that he had been really exploring consciousness. And that was one aspect of it. And I think that, it's curious because he never renounced psychedelics, always honored what they had done in his opening. And at the same time, I think he was very committed to their being used in the right way. They really started and grounded that whole set and setting part
yeah,
of using psychedelics, which is now really part and parcel of the research projects these days, which have been revived. And I remember there was at one point one of his students in the early days had gone off to do a retreat in a cave, I think in Arizona, and had died. And the indication was that he had probably taken LSD and done some, intensive breathing practice or something like that, and had, burst an artery or something. And it almost was like a suicide. And it bothered Ram Dass a lot. And because he felt in some way responsible.
mm,
And he asked Maharaj-ji about it next time he went back to India. And Maharaj-ji's indication to him was that had been, that kid had really gone to the next phase of his enlightenment. And that it was not, while it looked like a bad thing from the physical plane, he was okay.
yeah.
And Ram Dass found that very reassuring. And I think, that he felt like some of the karma of that period was not as heavy as he might have imagined it.
Interesting.
But he pushed that the psychedelic stuff to the limits. You can read about that bowling alley experiment they did at Millbrook, which in retrospect looks completely crazy to me. But, they took
Tell us
LSD
about that
every day
experience.
for
Yeah.
3 weeks or a month.
Oh, geez. I wanted to ask, the book is out, it's available. What would you hope people get out of reading the book? What would Ram Dass have hoped people got out of reading the book?
Well, I think his life is kind of a parable that other people can use, especially in terms of his search for identity, which was certainly part of my own journey. But I think everyone is working in that direction to some degree. And especially young people, I think, find that really helpful. And I think his attitude toward practice also, of kind of the eclecticism and taking what you can use and losing the rest and not getting too caught in the forms. And I think the trajectory of his life from that very kind of intellectual background in psychology and academics through psychedelics and then all of the yoga practice, which really brought him into this just deeper and deeper state of love. And if that's where you end up, it's not too bad.
No.
No, and I was struck by, like Dennis, I haven't had time to read the whole book, but I shot ahead to the end. I wanted to see what he said about the last years, as up until you finish the book. And it's a deeply moving section of the book because he's looking he's looking at death and squarely. It's something we're all going to have to do, and should he's in that sense a role model for how approaching that stage of life. But at one point he said he moved from thinking about love to being love.
Yeah.
And I thought that's powerful. What was it like to be with him in those days?
It was like he had become, instead of a teacher who was telling you about things and giving practices or even leading meditation, that he was just radiating love, and he had just become that sort of he had become that state to some extent. And we in the first book that I worked on with him, which was called Be Love Now, we started exploring that state, and not just through his work, but there are a lot of stories of the Indian saints and about Maharaj-ji, and it was really, I think that became evident, and he began to talk about love as a state of being instead of as a relationship. And that, I think, is a different way of looking at it. And again, it's that sort of shift in point of view that I think is really helpful at some point.
Dennis, let me follow up. He also writes in those days, or you and he, about looking forward to death in a certain way. You saw that, the body was just like a nuisance, it sounded like, after a while. Did he express that at times? Did it alarm people? How did people around him react to, him being candid about such things?
Yeah, I have never been with anybody who was less afraid of dying. I don't think he had much fear about it at all. And he had worked with so many people at that time of transition, and sat with people during the AIDS crisis, and in many other situations for years. I mean, starting with his mother's death, he'd really kind of seen that the approach to death in our culture needed to change. And he was working on it, you know, for himself, of course, also. And I think that what had occurred with when our guru died in 1973, and we were, I expected him to be there for a long time, and he in India there's a phrase when like there's a bus accident or something like that, and the driver runs away. They say he absconded. And I think that's what Maharaj-ji did. And that's what Ram Dass did too. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, because he left me to finish the editing and do the, get through the publication of this thing. And it was very light for him. But being with him when he died, and it's the only time I've actually sat with somebody when they left their body. And it was not like a moment, and my own emotions were so mixed. I mean, I was so sorry to, have him go, because my time with him was so enjoyable. And probably I prolonged this project somewhat so I could hang out with him more. But I was also so happy for him to get out of that body, which, as you say, had gotten, less and less viable. And he had a lot of pain all the time. He had diabetes, he had neuropathy in his feet, the effects of the stroke had on the paralyzed side of his body had left things in pretty bad shape. And he never complained. I mean, you could question him closely, and then he would kind of admit that, this or that was really bothering him. But he had a way of working with that, which I think also took him through, which was, kind of detachment, and I think really centered on that ability to not identify so much with the body. There's a chapter near the end where we speculated not about the after death state, but about the before birth part, and what it might have been like in, I guess what you would call kind of an astral plane, planning his birth as Richard Alpert with Maharaj-ji. It's a fantasy, but it's also kind of, I think, what he thought of as how it really works.
Right.
And the reincarnation part was something that resonated for him deeply. And I will say that after he left his body, his presence was very strong. I mean, and it was familiar to me. It's not, I kind of, you can say it's imagination or whatever. In fact, people used to ask him, as somebody said to him, he often told this story, but somebody would say to him, you talk to your dead guru? And he would say, yeah. And the person said, that's your imagination. And he said, yeah.
Great answer. Phil, any final questions?
Yeah, we only have a couple of minutes, Ramesh.
No, this has been fun. Thank you.
One of the things that struck me when I saw the book was there's a few unusual things about it. no author name on the cover, just
Yeah.
being Ram Dass with this incredible picture. And on the back, instead of the usual endorsement blurbs or, description of the book, there's just love everyone, serve everyone, remember God, tell the truth, which, as I understand it, is what Maharaj-ji or Neem Karoli
Yeah.
Baba would say.
He did
And
say.
yes, and so there it is on the
Yeah.
only thing on the back of the cover. So I'm curious if in a minute or two, why that decision to design it that way, and what have those words meant to you over time?
Well, I finally got my name on the book on the spine, but
Yes, it is. And but also in the flap, you got your
oh yeah,
picture. And
no, I mean we very much. I mean, first of all, I loved having that photo on the cover, and my thought was that it was such a strong image. Those eyes. I figured, if you saw that across a bookstore aisle, it would probably grab your attention.
yeah.
And of course, no
When there
bookstores
were
were open, but
bookstores,
what to
yes.
do? That will hopefully occur once more.
Yeah.
And
We have less than a minute, Phil, just so you know.
Yeah.
okay,
Well,
this was something along the line of his becoming nobody in his life.
Having the design on the back that way with
Yeah.
you,
And it's so
he
much
would have
about
wanted that.
Maharaj-ji and that relationship with him
Yeah.
that was seemed like the core.
Was he still around when that decision was made?
No. Mm-mm. We
So,
finished the cover design and the editing after he had died.
and it probably had to do a lot of fact checking.
Yeah, we did some fact checking. And one of the things he was very concerned about was hurting anyone's feelings.
Yeah.
So we did our best with that. We probably did anyway, but
And checking one another's memories. And
yeah.
I know I worked with a famous person on a memoir once, and that the memory pieces checked against newspaper records was a project. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for producing
You guys are
this
great.
very important and useful book. I hope everybody reads it.
it's the book.
Being Ram
We'll have all the
Das.
information posted up as well.
Okay. Thanks for being with us, Ramesh. Take good care. We'll let you know when
Thank you.
this is up.
Ramesh, the author, co-author, along with Ram Dass of the book, yeah, fabulous book, and the book simply called Being Ram Dass. And like I said, I picked it up and I started reading little segments in different parts of the book, here, there, and everywhere, and it was really well done. And for me, I got involved maybe a little after they did in a spiritual quest back in the late '60s, as did you, even before me. And so seeing how it played out over 50 years or more for Ram Dass and for the author, it's fascinating. It's interesting. And obviously Ram Dass had left a very big, important imprint on the planet, on his generation. And I think it's carrying forward. And so for me, it was really, allowed me to reflect back on those decades as well.
Yeah.
So very well done, worth reading. And if you didn't go through that period, read it. I mean, it'll give you a taste of it for sure.
No, I agree. Ram Dass really, as I said in the interview, loomed as a really important historic figure in the cultural and spiritual evolution of our era. And he was a prototype. When he started teaching, when he came back from India, there weren't that many Westerners taking on that role of being exponents of Indian philosophy and hosting satsangs and all that. There were, of course, there were already TM teachers and yoga teachers and people in Westerners in Yogananda's lineage and Vivekananda. All that stuff was going on, but it was minuscule. The floodgates would open up afterward, and Ram Dass was a kind of prototype of a Westerner doing these teachings responsibly and in a way that really did justice to them. He was an important role model in that sense. The other thing, and I meant to bring this up with Ramesh, was one of the things that made Ram Dass beloved was he kind of didn't take on the guru role in the sense of having disciples. And he was very candid about his own struggles, his own challenges being a spiritual person in the world. He had a great, his humor was a big asset, and a big target of his humor was himself and his quirks and his personalities and his, the madness we all deal with, the crazy little neuroses and everything, and that we hope to overcome on the spiritual path. He made all that acceptable for all of us to deal with.
Right, and also at that time, he was a Harvard professor, and then Timothy Leary came. They were Harvard professors, so they were held in high academic esteem, and they were taken seriously. And they really pushed it to the limits with the psychedelics and whatnot. And then they both were relieved of their duties, but they moved on and they continued to have influence. I think there were some differences in that Ram Dass actually very much accepted and respected a traditional guru-disciple relationship, where that was less for Timothy Leary. But nonetheless, and look, the research that they were doing back then is now being done in a very controlled way at Johns Hopkins and New York universities and other well-known and well-respected research institutes, because psychedelics were obviously very misused, and there was a lot of bad endings with it. But because of that, the initial research, which led one to believe that maybe they could be helpful in certain circumstances and certain contexts, was gone, and now I think that's coming back. And again, in a responsible, controlled way, not like it was back then.
Well, but it started out that way. It started out responsible and controlled. People like Stan Groff and at first Richard Alpert and Tim Leary, and an old, a late friend of mine, Oscar Janiger, was, a psychiatrist doing those studies in LA back in the 50s, and then early 60s. And they were, once it hit the streets and, the government shut things down, it took a long time for responsible research to start up again. But then,
I have to ask, when did you interview Ram Dass for your book, American Veda?
Well, the book was published in 2010, so it must have been 2008-ish.
What was his health situation?
It was on the phone. It was on the phone, so I couldn't see him. Well, he had already had the stroke and was living in Hawaii. And I remember, but he was, he was there. But it was one of the interesting things about that was he knew, because of the stroke, there was sometimes a gap between his wanting to say something and being able to access the words and expressing them. So because we were on the phone, he warned me before we started the interview that there may be moments like that. There may be that he wouldn't be able to speak.
Right.
And he said, just, wait, just be patient, because he said sometimes it's like I'm sitting in the lobby waiting for the words to arrive, in the hotel lobby. Yeah, and it was like that. There were pauses. but you know, because I had been warned. But it was lovely to be able to get his perspective on all that, and I, you know, quote him in the book.
Yeah. I mean, of all the Westerners, his impact on American spirituality has to be right up there.
Oh yeah,
You know, it's because you know, the other teachers and all were from the East, were from overseas, and then came,
yeah,
or or was the students, and you know, although he did have a teacher and all. And again, you had mentioned it. A couple of other interviews you'll find in our archives. Mirabai Starr was very close to Ram
right.
Dass, and Larry
That's true.
Brilliant,
And Larry
who
and Jia
Ramesh
Uttal was part.
referred to as a brother. You know, they were you know, very involved in the same time, and
Yeah,
fascinating stuff.
there's a very important phenomenon, and one thing people don't often realize, but you know, it comes up because I teach classes and stuff based on American Veda, and I always play a clip of Ram Dass speaking about meeting Neem Karoli Baba and all that. But when he was in India searching around and then finding Neem Karoli and being with Neem Karoli at the ashram, it overlapped the Beatles being in India.
Oh,
You know,
really?
just yeah,
The
you
same
know,
here in '68.
yes, and that confluence. I mean, these important Western figures being in India at the same time, and then the impact of those journeys coming back and resonating in the West. It's a
Right.
fascinating
And
thing.
I remember the story Larry Brilliant told, the way he met Ram Dass was, he was in India at the ashram, and he was online picking up something, and I think Ram Dass was being sent the first copies of Be Here Now.
Yes.
Right. What a great story.
Yeah, there are a lot of great stories, and Ram Dass was a great storyteller. He was a tremendous raconteur. That's why I asked Ramesh, because you know, as an author of books and somebody who interviews people, and as I said, I ghost wrote a memoir of a famous athlete, and you know, the stories are great, but stories change in your memory over decades.
Right.
It's like I wrote, you know, my novel that I published is based on my own childhood, and after a while, I didn't know the difference between what actually I was remembering and what I created in my mind
Right.
over time. I had to, you know, and it's very hard to separate those things. And if you're writing a, you know, a piece of history like this is, you know, you probably have to go back and
A good
check
reason to
some
keep a
facts.
journal,
Yeah.
so you know fact from fiction. Yeah.
Anyway,
Great
I
book.
think this is a very important book.
I agree. And I'll show you the back of the book, which has
yes, love everyone, serve everyone, remember God, tell the truth. Here we are, Dennis, telling the
wrap it up.
truth for our listeners.
Yes, February, end of February 2021. Hopefully, we're on the tail end of the pandemic period. Let's hope, and you know, we go back to. But I think it's been a period not unlike the late '60s, where there was upheaval, tremendous change, but it also motivated people to go inward, and maybe motivated people to spend more time listening to our podcast.
And to do something useful in the world. And
Right.
that's serve everyone part of it. Ram Dass modeled that too. He did.
Right.
He
Larry Brilliant, who was
and a lot of the
unbelievable
people who
life,
were part of that cohort, including Ram Dass. I mean, Ram Dass did a lot of hard work working with the dying and the, you know, the
Prison.
Seva Foundation, and that piece of it is something also that those of us on a spiritual path should emulate, and it's needed now. And one of the acts of service people can do is contribute to Spirit Matters.
Oh, thank you for saying that, because I used to think just go to spiritmatterstalk.com, and if you want to contribute, again, we're not a nonprofit, it's not a donation, but we will happy to receive your contribution. And we have a great, what do we have? 250, 300 interviews in our archives. Now, the opportunity to see us on video.
See us.
This is, those that are listening, if you go to our YouTube channel, which is soon to be up. You'll get to see
Well, by the
Phil
time people hear
and
this,
me.
it should be up. And that people's contributions made it possible for us to convert and also have video as well as audio. So thank
Convert
you.
from
Keep
audio
it
to
up.
video, because when you say convert, could mean any one of a number of things.
Okay. We have both audio and video now.
All
All
right.
right, Dennis. See you
Till
next
next time.
time.
Thank you.